The Arab-Israeli War of 1967 marked a fundamental turning point in international relations. The State of Israel absorbed 3 times its former territory, and the spectacular Arab defeat signaled the failure of pan-Arabism as an ideological force in the Middle East. The cult of Nasser, as the leader of Arab nationalism, would never be restored to its former glory. Israel emerged as a dominating victor from this war and began to occupy the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. The war, which many Arab leaders strived to launch themselves, turned out to be a disaster. What were the preconditions, and was it really, as many claim, an imminent conflict? In order to understand this conflict and the reasons behind the decision-making, we have to look at the development of the Jewish-Arab relationship in the region. The War of 1948 was a turning point that marked the beginning of increasing aggression and hatred between the two worlds. Arabs never forgot their humiliating defeat, and the idea of revenge and recapture of the whole of Palestine was strongly present in the minds of both Arab leaders and the society. Israel, on the other hand, had learned to live in a land surrounded by enemies and constant threats. This made Israelis develop an extremely self-protective identity, which became a core principle in their decision-making process. Everything that Israel did had to be evaluated under one main criterion: will or will it not lead to a greater chance of survival for an Israel state? The Suez Crisis of 1957 only increased the tension in the region. The poor decision of Israel to invade Egypt did not lead to any positive development of the relationship between the two countries. As a result of a peace treaty, the whole of the Sinai Peninsula became a demilitarized zone where no Egyptian troops were allowed to enter. The crisis resulted in the increase of anti-Semitism and openly anti-Jewish rhetoric of Egyptian leader Abdel Nasser. By way of transforming this militant rhetoric into concrete plans, in January 1964, the Egyptian president convened the first All-Arab Summit in Cairo to discuss ways and means to confront the Israeli threat. A prominent item on the agenda was the adoption of a joint strategy to prevent Israel from using the Jordan River waters to irrigate the barren Negev desert in the south of the country. Another goal was to lay the proper foundations for organizing and arming the Palestinian people. 4 months later, a gathering of 422 Palestinian activists in East Jerusalem established the Palestine Liberation Organization and approved its 2 founding documents, the organization's basic constitution and the Palestinian National Covenant. In a second summit meeting in Alexandria in October 1964, the heads of the Arab states accepted Nasser's long-term anti-Israel strategy. The military, economic, social, and political coordinated buildup of Arab nations was beginning. The Palestine Liberation Organization was authorized to create an army of Palestinian volunteers, to which the Arab governments pledged to give support, and a special fund was established for the reorganization of the Lebanese, Syrian, and Jordanian armies under a united Arab command. Before long, this organized pan-Arab drive for Israel's destruction was disrupted by an unexpected sequence of events. The event that triggered this escalation was a Soviet warning in early May 1967 of large-scale Israeli troop concentrations along the border with Syria aimed at launching an immediate attack. Nasser had no choice but to come to the rescue of a supposedly threatened ally tied to Egypt in a bilateral defense treaty since November 1966. On May 14th, the Egyptian armed forces were placed on the highest alert, and 2 armored divisions began moving into the formerly demilitarized Sinai Peninsula. Nevertheless, according to reports, there was no trace of Israeli concentrations along the Syrian border or troop movements in northern Israel. Nasser knew about it but chose not to change his course of action. He only needed an excuse, and it did not matter if it was real or a lie. Within less than 24 hours, Nasser's objective had been transformed from the deterrence of an Israeli attack against Syria into an outright challenge to the status quo established after the 1956 war. It is precisely here that the Arab-Israeli conflict's general cause of rejection of Israel's very existence played its role in Nasser's decision-making. In one day, he had managed to undo one of Israel's foremost gains in the 1956 Suez Crisis, the de facto demilitarization of the Sinai Peninsula. Addressing Egyptian pilots in Sinai on May 22nd, he announced the closure of the Strait of Tiran at the southern mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli and Israel-bound shipping. The Strait of Tiran was an extremely important strategic location for Israel, since it was the only way they could receive shipments coming from the Red Sea. The blockade of the Straits of Tiran posed an imminent threat to Israel's economy and security. Nasser understood what his actions might lead to, but nevertheless continued his chain of escalation for the purpose of supporting his pan-Arab ideology. The die was cast. He was approaching the brink with open eyes, and if there was no way out of the crisis other than war, so be it. Daily consultations between the political and the military leaderships were held. The Egyptian forces in Sinai were assigned their operational tasks. The closer Nasser came to the brink, the more aggressive he became. In his May 22nd speech, he said, "The Jews have threatened war. We tell them you are welcome. We are ready for war. Our main objective will be the destruction of Israel. Now that we have the situation as it was before 1956, Allah will certainly help us to restore the status quo of before 1948. By this time, the conflict was no longer about freedom of navigation in the Gulf of Aqaba, let alone the alleged Israeli threat to Syria. It had been transformed into a jihad to eradicate the foremost remnant of Western imperialism in the Middle East. On the morning of May 30th, Jordan's King Hussein arrived in Cairo, where he immediately signed a defense pact with Egypt. On June 4th, Iraq followed suit by also entering into a defense agreement with Egypt. The balance of forces, so it seemed to the Arabs, had irreversibly shifted in their favor. The Arab alliance included Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. The moment of reckoning with the Zionist entity, as they pejoratively called Israel, had come. Nevertheless, Nasser still feared the US intervention if the Arab forces were to launch an offensive war. Given Nasser's belief in the US commitment to Israel's territorial integrity, the plans to eliminate the whole state of Israel could hardly be implemented if Egypt were to take the military initiative. Their execution as an act of self-defense in response to an Israeli attack was a completely different matter. In his May 30th visit to Cairo, King Hussein was assured by Nasser of Egypt's full preparedness against an Israeli airstrike. Nasser was confident that no more than 15 to 20% losses would be incurred before the Egyptian Air Force dealt a devastating blow to Israel. The other members of the Jordanian delegation heard equally confident words from Abdel Hakim Amer, Nasser's deputy and commander of the Egyptian armed forces. The Arab forces were delusionally confident in their superiority over the enemy, which would prove to be their fatal mistake. The war actually began Monday morning, the 5th of June, with a carefully planned and extraordinarily well-coordinated preemptive attack by the Israeli Air Force, shortly IAF, on Egyptian airfields and aircraft. For the purpose of clarity, we will first discuss the air combat separately from the ground operations. The first wave of 40 aircraft simultaneously struck 10 airfields at 7:45 a.m. The 10 airfields attacked in this strike were El Arish, Gebel Libni, Bir Gifgafa, and Bir Thamada in the Sinai Desert, Abu Suer, Kabrit, and Fayid along the Suez Canal, Inchus, Cairo West, and Beni Suef on the banks of the Nile River. During this opening attack, by far the greater part of the Egyptian Air Force was caught on the ground. The primary objective of the first strike was to render the runways unusable and to destroy as many MiG-21 aircraft as possible. As the first wave of Israeli aircraft struck, the second wave was already on its way, and the third was getting airborne. These pulverizing attacks lasted 80 minutes, 8 waves in all. In 170 minutes, the IAF had broken the back of the Egyptian Air Force as a fighting force. Altogether, 19 Egyptian airfields were struck the first morning. By 10:35 a.m., some 300 Egyptian aircraft had been destroyed. The IAF's attention next turned to Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. Shortly before noon, the Syrian Air Force damaged the Israeli oil refinery at Haifa and destroyed several dummy aircraft at the Megiddo airfield. Israel's retaliation included simultaneous attacks on 5 Syrian airfields, destroying 60 of her 127 combat aircraft. At this point, Syria withdrew the remainder of her air forces from the battle area. At about the same time, the Jordanian Air Force bombed near Netanya and destroyed an Israeli transport at Kefir Sirkin Air Base. The Israeli response wiped out the Jordanian Air Force, demolishing all 21 of its combat aircraft, heavily damaging the air bases at Amman and Mafraq, and destroying the powerful radar station at Adlun. Finally, at about 2 p.m., Iraqi planes raided the Israeli base at Ramat David. Again, the IAF retaliated by striking the Iraqi airfield and destroying at least 10 Iraqi aircraft on the ground. Israel's air offensive on the 5th of June had been overwhelming. The second day's air war went much like the first. By midnight on the 6th of June, Israel had destroyed 415 Arab aircraft, 393 of them on the ground, while losing only 26. As for the ground operations, they were split into 3 separate sections, with the first being Egypt and the Sinai campaign. During the last half of May, the 2 Egyptian divisions stationed in the desolate Sinai were reinforced with 5 more, bringing the total to 90,000 men equipped with close to 1,000 tanks. The Egyptian forces were deployed in a defensive-offensive array on 3 interlinked lines between Israel and Egypt to permit absorbing an Israeli blow and swinging to the counteroffensive. This deployment blocked all main lines of advance through the desert with massive troop concentrations and strongly fortified positions. Against these forces, the Israelis marshaled 3 divisions, identified by the names of their commanders, Tal, Yofa, and Sharon, and 2 brigades, a total of 45,000 men and 650 tanks. The 3 divisions were concentrated at 3 points on a 50-mile front. One of the brigades was deployed near the Gaza Strip and the other near Kuntilla on the southern axis. Thus, while the Egyptians dispersed their armor, the Israelis concentrated theirs in a mailed fist, directed at a narrow sector in a purely offensive strategy. At 8:15 a.m. on the 5th of June, General Tal began the attack near Rafah with the objective of seizing El Arish, the Egyptians' primary logistic base for Sinai forces. Under extremely intense fire and without air support, the initial breakthrough came at Khan Yunis with heavy casualties. Once in Khan Yunis, the Israelis smashed into Rafah, avoiding minefields by advancing swiftly in columns on the Egyptians' internal roads. By midnight Monday, Tal's thrust had reached El Arish. General Sharon's division made the second Israeli breakthrough in a brilliant night battle on the 5th of June at Abu Aghila. The enemy position was heavily fortified with several concrete parallel trenches 3 miles long, dense minefields, and strong armor and infantry flank support. The Israelis assaulted the strong point in a 3-pronged attack. Paratroopers silenced artillery positions from the rear, infantry and armor smashed frontline positions, and the northern perimeter was pounded with tanks and troops. By 6 a.m. on Tuesday, the 6th of June, the Israeli army had achieved one of its greatest tactical successes, the overwhelming of Abu Aghila. With their breakthrough at Rafah and Abu Aghila, the Israelis were now behind the bulk of the Egyptian army, and 2 gateways into the heart of the Sinai were open to them. Tal's forces advanced along the coastal and northerly route through Bir Gifgafa to block a possible Egyptian escape route. Yofa's forces, on the other hand, moved en route to seal Mitla Pass. Further to the south, at Sharm el-Sheikh, the Egyptians abandoned the promontory dominating the Straits of Tiran shortly before the Israeli naval and paratrooper assault force arrived on Wednesday morning, the 7th of June. In less than 60 hours after leaving Israel, Yofa's lead armor unit had reached Mitla, and later that same evening, Tal's forces were blocking the road to Ismailia. Thus, deprived of much of its leadership, a continuous stream of Egyptian troops, vehicles, and armor rushed in full flight from central and eastern Sinai towards Mitla Pass, without knowing that it had been sealed off by the IAF and Yofa's forces. As the Egyptians converged from all directions, the IAF strafed and bombed them continuously with rockets, napalm, and high explosives. Yofa's forces completed the slaughter. With the remnants of 7 Egyptian divisions stranded in the desert behind them, Tal and Yofa began their last advance westward to the Suez Canal. By the 9th of June, Yofa's forces had reached the canal opposite. On the same day, Egypt's representative to the UN unconditionally accepted a ceasefire. The Sinai campaign was over. In 4 days, the Israelis had decisively defeated Egypt's proud army of 90,000 men. The second front was Jordan and the West Bank campaign. On the eve of the war, the Jordanians had concentrated at least 9 of its 11 brigades, approximately 45,000 men, on the West Bank. These forces were deployed in 2 defensive sectors, a northern defensive region in Samaria, based on the cities of Jenin and Nablus, and a Judean region, extending south from Ramallah along the Judean hills through Jerusalem to Hebron. This distribution of forces indicated a defensive deployment, but the outlines of an offensive deployment were developing. The emphasis was to hold firm the nodal sectors around Jerusalem and Jenin, defending the rest of the front more lightly. On the Israeli side of the Jordanian frontier, General Narkis, commanding Israel's Central Command, also had 9 brigades. Thus, the total number of forces on the Israeli-Jordanian front was relatively evenly matched, approximately 45,000 soldiers on each side. By 9 a.m. on the 5th of June, King Hussein had been informed of Israel's attack on Egypt. At about the same time, sporadic firing broke out along the Jerusalem perimeter from the Jordanian side, and soon afterward shells began falling on the Israeli side of the city. Shortly before noon, General Narkis was ordered to open an offensive in the Jerusalem area. The second front was about to open. The 3 minimum objectives of Israel were: first, to push the border south in the Jenin region to protect the airfield and Jezreel Valley settlements from Jordan's artillery; second, to secure and widen the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv corridor by cutting off the Latrun salient; and 3, to secure a link with the Mount Scopus enclave separated from Israel since 1948. As in the Sinai, actual operations went according to plan, except that the Israelis encountered stiffer resistance and relied more on the IAF to prevail. By mid-morning on the 7th of June, the Israelis had captured the ancient Jewish capital of Jerusalem. On the same day, Israeli forces had reached the Daria Bridge on the Jordan River. Fighting halted as Israeli and Jordanian commanders accepted a UN call for a ceasefire at 8 p.m. on the 7th of June. In less than 3 days, the Israelis had captured Jerusalem and the entire West Bank. The third and last front was Syria and the Golan Heights campaign. Between 1948 and 1967, the Syrians converted the Golan Heights into a large, fortified camp complete with gun emplacements, bunkers, and dug-in tanks. These fortifications were concentrated along the western edge of the heights overlooking the Hula Valley and the Sea of Galilee. Along this 70-kilometer Golan Plateau, the Syrians had deployed about 8 brigades, around 40,000 soldiers, by early June, with a concentration in the north, centered around Quneitra. The Israelis, commanded by General Elazar, countered with 30,000 troops and about 250 tanks. During the war's initial 4 days, 5 to the 8th of June, the Syrian front was the least active of the 3 combat fronts. During this time, the Israelis remained in a defensive deployment, under intense artillery fire, awaiting the outcome of the Egyptian and Jordanian fronts. Following the news of success, General Elazar began his assault, crossing the Syrian border at 11:30 a.m. on the 9th of June. His objective was to capture the Golan Heights. The primary thrust was undertaken near Tel Fahar, with several secondary penetrations to occur further south. The attack began at one of the steepest points on the escarpment, with 2 brigades advancing behind 8 bulldozers under intense enemy fire. The other brigade, advancing slightly to the north, fought to widen the penetration corridor to overcome 13 positions, the principal of which was Tel Fahar. With the principal assault broken through in the north, some smaller breaches of the Syrian line were made further south. Early on the 10th of June, fresh troops began pouring through the holes opened the day before, and with massive air support began pressing simultaneously from all directions. This massive retreat continued for the rest of the day, until the ceasefire became effective at 6:30 p.m. on the 10th of June. The Israelis had captured the entire southwestern corner of Syria, including all of the strategically important Golan Heights. In less than 2 days, the Syrian army had suffered a costly defeat. In just 6 days, Israel had overrun and captured approximately 26,000 square miles of Arab territory in an offensive war on 3 separate fronts. She had convincingly defeated numerically superior Arab forces with exceptionally small losses. The Israelis officially suffered the following losses: 977 were killed and 4,025 wounded. At the same time, Egyptian losses were as high as 11,500 killed and 20,000 wounded. Jordanian losses were 696 killed and 421 wounded. Lastly, Syria suffered a loss of 1,000 soldiers killed and 2,000 wounded. The June 1967 war was a direct result of pan-Arabism's delusions of grandeur. The magnitude of the defeat thus punctured the pan-Arab bubble of denial and suggested to the Arabs that military force had its limits. Israel's war objectives were attained. The Straits of Tiran and the Gulf were open to navigation, and the homeland had been preserved against the Egypt-Jordan-Syria threat. Nonetheless, the unforgettable victory began to create as many problems for Israel as it had temporarily solved. In just over 6 years, Israel would once again be locked in combat with the Arabs in the War of Yom Kippur. As for the captured land, Israel eventually returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in 1982 as part of a peace treaty, and then withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Nevertheless, it has continued to occupy and settle other territories claimed in the Six-Day War, most notably the Golan Heights and the West Bank. The status of these territories continues to be a stumbling block in Arab-Israeli peace negotiations.